to introduce Ed and today's webinar. This webinar will engage attendees on 3 essential elements of intersectionality in sustainability education: citizenship and sustainable development, character development in young learners, and the future of a sustainable society. We will discuss and ideate relative to an established character-based learning model for secondary school and undergraduate application, assessment of learning tools for this model, and context related to ecosystems vibrancy, citizenship and leadership, and finding one's calling in the work world. Attendees will come away with practical techniques for applying these modalities in their own institutes of learning and applied research. I'm especially pleased to welcome my friend and colleague, Ed Quevedo, to lead this webinar. Ed directs the Regenerative Design Program within the Foresight+Innovation Lab, a collaborative advisory and creative agency composed of educators, policy innovators, social entrepreneurs, sustainability practitioners, and nonprofit leaders working together to build the new regenerative economy. The new regenerative economy is a fundamental reframing of the conventional consumer economy grounded on integrity, sufficiency, social justice, and ecological regeneration, rather than consumption, exploitation, and the destruction of ecosystems in the relentless pursuit of profit. As a senior creative and trusted advisor, Ed has worked internationally and domestically, guiding and advising some of the world's most iconic and highly regarded companies, philanthropies, institutions of higher learning, and civil society organizations. Prior to launching the lab with his fellow agents in early 2017, Ed served as a research affiliate at the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, where he directed their program in regenerative future economies, and he contributed to the Institute's Peace and Social Justice Lab. Ed has led practice groups in strategy, foresight and innovation, environmental law, and sustainable development at some of the most respected law firms and creative agencies in North America and around the world. He also has enjoyed an extensive history in higher education. From 2013 to 2016, Ed was faculty in sustainable enterprise at the Lorry I Lokey Graduate School of Business and Public Policy at Mills College, and director and senior research fellow at the Mills College Center for Socially Responsible Business. Ed was also on the faculty at Presidio Graduate School, where he held the chair as dean of the faculty. From 2003 through 2010, he was faculty within the Green MBA Program at the School of Business and Leadership at the Dominican University of California. Ed makes his home in Northern California, where he continues to learn from his children and the local communities he is privileged to serve. With that, Ed, my warm welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ira, and thank you, everyone. I will say that Ira is very gracious in going through the whole bio. I'm sorry it was so lengthy. It's all a way of saying that I've been around for a while and I've done a little bit of this and that. It's a privilege to be with you this morning/afternoon to go through this topic, which is near and dear to my heart and to our agency's work. I will dive in only to say that the work of our agency has 2 basic footings. One is advising philanthropies, companies, universities, and communities on systemic change to shift the economy at scale to build an economy worthy of our affection. The other side is a think tank side where we run our Future of Learning and Regenerative Justice Cities program. This program we're going to go through today comes out obviously of our Regenerative Justice and Future of Learning program. This is just a quick overview, and it's against the rules to read your slides, so I'm not going to burden you with that. I will say that I am keen to have this be interactive as we can. I was kind enough to field your questions and to pull together your comments, which you're welcome to post in the chat box, but I'm hoping we can open up microphones one at a time and engage in some dialogue. And there will be pauses and inflection points here where I really want to take your views and questions and answers. I've told Ira that I'm very... I'm happy to share the deck with you all if it's of any use, and I'm also happy to have follow-up conversation, but I'm only going to engage in about 15 to 20 minutes of overview and then dive into providing you with some opportunities for dialogue on this various set of topics. So we will get through this and we will finish by a quarter past the hour, a quarter past 3 Eastern, a quarter past noon here on the Pacific Coast. So I just want to give some credit where credit is due. I have the privilege of being surrounded by some extraordinarily talented agents who direct various aspects of our agency platform. If there's anything useful in what I say here, it's the result of the good organizations that have allowed us to do this work with them over the last 20 years, and my brilliant colleagues with whom I have the privilege of serving. If there are mistakes and befuddlement here, it's my own. And again, I want to encourage you to challenge some of these ideas. I would appreciate it if a few of you could, either in the chat box or by requesting that your microphone be open, state some intention. I'm conscious that we are human beings in a highly non-human webinar platform, and as a longtime educator, I've had the view that it's hard to grow vegetables online, so I know that it's important to take a minute to remember that we're human and to state some intention so that we can come together, because we've all had a fair bit of logistics associated with coming together on the webinar this morning / afternoon. So I'll say that my intention is only to offer with some humility a little bit of provocation. That's my intention setting, some provocation that will hopefully encourage you to think differently about how we approach the environment in which young learners mature, to think differently about how they find their work in the world, and about how we wage a more successful battle for the culture of our nation. Because at the end of the day, in these united times in which we find ourselves, our work in this agency and the work of character-based learning is about building a national culture that is whole, humane, and verdant, rather than separate, partisanized, polarized, and harmful to community and well-being, and certainly to the future of our children. So if any of you would like to offer either in the chat box, which Ira will share with the group, or if you'd like to have your microphones open, I would welcome a few of you at least stating some intentions in terms of your curiosity or what you'd like to take away from or get out of our conversation today. Those of you who are teachers will know that as a teacher, I'm comfortable with awkward silences. So I'm not seeing or hearing anything. Ira, is there anything coming across by way of intention setting from our colleagues online?
The first one just came through from Pilar. My intention in participating is to continue learning how to be in a good relationship with all beings in the planet and leave a better place for the next generation. And from Cynthia Lee, I'd like to see how this applies to my sustainability internship program.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thanks to both of you. I think we can talk certainly in the course of this dialogue together about the relevance of this to a sustainability internship program. And Cynthia, I'm happy to take this conversation offline if it can be helpful. I will give you an overview of this approach to character-based learning, which, as I say, emerges from our Future of Learning program. We have piloted this now in 5 high schools, in 3 undergraduate programs, and in 12 graduate programs to assess the extent to which character-based learning can drive a fundamentally different approach to how young people find their work in the world and contribute to a national dialogue about strengthening and building our culture. Our hypothesis in this work is that through this kind of integration of learning, building on the platforms that are well studied and well documented of project-based learning, experiential learning, and service learning, that character-based learning provides students with the opportunity to do what they're entitled to do. Our advocacy here is that no child should settle for having a job, because a job is what we had when we were 16 years old and we were working solely for the money. No young person should be satisfied or saddled with only having a career, which our economy deigns to be the highest and best use of someone's time. What should in fact be encouraged and provided for, and what we think this approach to learning engenders, is that young people find their calling, their highest purpose, the reason why they're here, and through their work find daily opportunities to experience humanity, nature, and the promise of a shared future, rather than an economic model that breeds consumers, consumption, and destruction of communities and ecosystems. So it's a relatively evocative approach. And again, I want to encourage you to ask questions and to challenge some of these ideas. The method of teaching is scaffolded to take students from the simplicity of single-track learning, which is highly fractionalized, and to push them towards polytechnic learning. And I'll get to the rootstock of this approach and the thinkers whose views have helped to frame the methodologies that we use in a couple of minutes. But I will say that we rely upon exposing students to different problem-solving skills on the theory that expertise is of no use today. Given the complexity and the size of the problems we face, there is no expertise. Humans have not had to muscle their way through the kinds of social, ecological, and economic problems that we face. So expertise is a foolhardy approach. It's in part why we have an agency and not a consultancy. We are not experts. We provoke potent inquiry and use the tools of systemic thinking, complex adaptive system theory, and diplomacy, all of which are skills that are core to the way we deliver our work, so that we can explore possible futures against the modalities of complexity that we're faced with. So I'm going to pause here and take a breath and see if we have any questions.
Ed, I have promised some of the attendees that when you take a breath, and I actually use that phrase, when you take a breath, there is a blocking of your slides on your screen by your GoToMeeting control panel. So you just need to move your GoToMeeting control panel over a bit.
Got you. Sorry about that, folks. Let me get that out of the way. How's that?
That looks better to me.
All right. Any questions or challenges, contrary thoughts, or points of inquiry at this point before I go on?
There were a couple of other comments from your earlier question. One participant said that she teaches at a university level, and many students have told me that they are apathetic. My intention here is to learn some methods to make them give a damn.
Excellent. That's excellent. I'm going to comment on that point directly in just a moment. Did you say there was another one? Okay.
I think we got.
All right. Okay. So what I'd like to do is to comment on that point as a way of moving into the method of assessing student experience. What we have found in our work, particularly with secondary school students, most of our courses have been piloted in the junior or 11th grade year, is that the difference between apathy and agency is the difference between classroom and the real world. We have found creative ways to do polytechnic learning across disciplines in a real world learning context where the students are in teams solving problems in their community. And those problems broadly fall into the same three categories that we've been talking about. Economic and financial first, ecosystems and natural resources second, and social and human capital driven third. From social justice to ecosystems restoration, from new models of banking and financial agency to solving the code of the disparate and cruel gap in earning between the rich and the poor. We've seen high school, graduate, and undergraduate students participate in meaningful work in the community, and the veneer of apathy falls away And what gets activated is their sense of agency, their ability to not only direct their own lives, but to make an impact in measurable ways in the communities where they live. So I want to encourage whoever asked that question to ask further questions about this as we go. I'm going to dive a little bit more into the method, and then we'll talk about the rootstock of where these ideas come from and what the data tell us about student experience.
Got another
approach. Oh, yes, please go ahead.
Another one. In a real world, how do learning institutions intend to overcome overall resistance to change, also known as wicked problems, from ongoing status quo issues, ? Both terms are policy in Australia.
I guess I would want the questioner to elaborate a bit, but I'll say this. Institutions of learning are fundamentally change-oriented. The unfortunate reality is in the United States, and I will mention that we've done this work internationally now for coming on 20 years, but in the United States, we have stripped academic institutions of their ability to have potency in the world, because anything that mitigates against the established economic interests of large corporations and the role of money and how we set policy is quickly relegated to the sideline. What we have found, whether working through Waldorf schools, charter schools, or a few brave superintendents at the public school level, is that institutions of learning in the secondary education domain can be catalysts for change when the students are the drivers, when the question is asked, what do you want to learn? And too often, the conversation between a teacher and a student, or between a faculty member and a student, reduces itself to, what are we going to do here? Our approach is, how are we going to be here? And I'll talk about the attributes of character that we have isolated and been measuring for, as I say, coming on 20 years in education, in classrooms, in organizations as elements of organizational culture, and in philanthropies as we look at how to catalyze and measure impact much more effectively. All of this relates to how education institutions at any level can be agents of change and not relegated to the role of propagating existing relationships and past dependence. So I think I want to move forward a little bit and talk about these measures. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I find that when we measure student experience, when we measure impact in the philanthropic setting, when we look at the kinds of results students can achieve through real-world learning in their communities, four-dimensional measures, leading, lagging, outcome, and output, illuminate much more the difference that a student can make, that a program of learning can make, and that a life can make in a community in building culture. So I'm not going to, again, violate the rules. I will, at the end, read a couple of potent quotes, but I'm not going to belabor us, but these are typical kinds of measures that we use to look at student experience. On the lagging side, on the leading side, I want to mention polytechnic learning, and I'll jump ahead briefly here. This approach is really catalyzed by four thinkers, well, five really, some collaborators, but I'm going to talk about one here. Edward O. Wilson, the brilliant entomologist and head of the Harvard program in zoology for many years. He's now emeritus. His book, Consilience, talks about the jumping together of all knowledge. And in this category, we have had the marginalization of the humanities for coming on 15 years as so-called STEM-based learning becomes the only course of relevance for a lot of funders. And I would argue strongly that in a world populated by, according to my data, human beings, that the humanities need to be reintroduced with vigor and energy into our curriculum as peer disciplines, because what we find reliably, whether they are CEOs telling us that our MBAs are unprepared to deal with real people, or whether they're faculty in engineering who are worried about the fact that they're not teaching people to be capable colleagues and curious and emotionally intelligent thinkers and just giving them technical skills, that in this category of polytechnic synthesis, we need to bring the humanities back to their proper place within the academy and certainly within high school curriculum. And we find this to be quite joyful in the experience we've had with primarily high school teachers. And that's what we refer to when we talk about polytechnic teaching and synthesis. Any questions at this point before I power through the rest of these points and jump into some of the background or rootstock of this kind of learning?
Please proceed.
All right. So now we're looking at some output measures of student experience. This is where agency begins to emerge, and we believe we can show on a progression the emergence of agency or self-determination within the student as she finds herself able to not only have an impact in her community and translate her classroom learning into something that makes a difference for the people she cares most about, but the relationship between that and finding her work in the world, so that she has an expectation that she will find work that catalyzes her thinking and that inspires her on a daily basis, which I think is what we all hope for. And certainly the calling of finding one's work in the world as a teacher is a great example of that. For that matter, Ira and I both came to the bar at a time when lawyering was done in the common interest and was a calling as opposed to just a way of making money. So outcome measures really take aim at trying to help a student to successfully solve wickedly complex problems through teamwork in the community, and in this process to build character. And I'm keen to get to these elements of character because I think this will catalyze some conversation and maybe provoke some controversy. We've thought about this issue of character for a long time. The inspiring seed of this idea was after some work we had done with a couple of large European companies where we had been measuring and reporting on intangible developments, things like happiness and inspiration and creativity at work. We were asked by a Canadian financial services company to build a management system to help them measure the growth of character in their people. To build a management system to help measure the growth of character in their people. And we knew we had to break down character into its constituent attributes. And this is when we began to think about attributes of what gives someone good character, how we recognize character in the world. And we broke this down into these three component parts. And we think that these are very central to not only how one contributes to making change in the world, but to how one develops a sense of agency. So we go from these sort of top line three elements of character to personality traits. I'll just mention a couple of these. A sense of justice and balance and proportion is fundamental, we think. It comes really out of the work of battlefield diplomacy, where one has to take people who are on one day seeking to eliminate each other through battlefield conflict and help find the common humanities that they have as a way of brokering peace. This is fundamental to the work of statescraft, and it's fundamental to the techniques we use in teaching, in social sculpturing, and in culture shift interventions in the work that we do in our agency. And this predisposition towards justice is a human attribute, and it has to do with proportionality and whether a student is trying to help a social entrepreneur interested in teaching food literacy to disadvantaged children in a impoverished neighborhood in Washington, D.C., or whether a student is trying to use art as a therapeutic tool to find common community voice to envision a community's future. We have student teams who are working on both those kinds of problems right now using this character-based model at the 11th grade real-world learning level. We think this attribute of justice is quite important in defining someone's ability to measurably grow their character. I'm going to mention two elements of this next breakdown of the personality characteristics of what builds strong character. One of them is transcendence, and it took us a while to understand this. It's, I think, fundamental to the human experience to have a sense of optimistic hope for the future, but there are many influences, not least of which is the relentless distraction brought to us by media today to keep us from paying attention to the fact that our lives are largely being hijacked by the material economy. It took us a while to try to put this notion of transcendence and hope for the future into words, but we think we can measure the ability of a student to bring transcendence to her and her teams and her peers' work in the context of dreaming big to find a shared future. Too often, the future is commoditized in the material economy, in the conventional economy. The future is commoditized as a way of talking about success through making more money, success through working harder, and certainly the place where I grew up, those of you who share this burden out here in California, in Silicon Valley, it's a badge of honor to work too hard, set aside the priorities of family. And this explains, as Robert Pullman has so brilliantly described in Bowling Alone, the collapse of civic engagement and civic pride in our communities across the United States. And we think this building this characteristic of transcendence in young people is essential in recapturing our sense of civic pride and civic unity, and certainly healing the wounds of a deeply riven culture. So having gone through these, before I go on, are there any questions or challenges to those elements? Because certainly one could say, well, you're forgetting this, you're forgetting that, when you think about the attributes of character.
Yeah, Ed, I actually was just communicating with one of our participants to see if he would like to be unmuted, since he was raising a question about this last segment. Let me see if I can do that.
Sure, that would be great. Thank you.
Matt, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're live.
Hi there. I'm enjoying it so far, but like everybody, I'm coming from a certain base, so I'm wrestling a little bit with what you're saying. For instance, I'm very familiar with a lot of the arguments for measurement, and I've written about some of the problems with measurement. And you're coming at it from a very different frame. You're bringing some very powerful, but usually intangible concepts, and you're using the term measurement. So I'm kind of wondering, what in terms of what are you proposing as far as actual quantitative measurement in terms of some of these concepts that you're talking about? Do you literally mean measure them in quantitative ways?
Excellent question, Matt, and I'm happy to have a bit of a dialogue here, and maybe this will draw other people into a conversation. So here's what we do. For each of these attributes of character, I've only taken a selection of them. For all 10 of them, we've come up with leading, lagging, outcome, and output measures about how they show up in a student's work, and whether this is a graduate student in public policy, an undergraduate student in business and economics, or a high school student in ecology. I'll give you an example in just a minute. We are confident that these can be qualitatively measured in terms of growth. Measuring a student at the beginning of the semester, for example, in terms of her exhibition of transcendence. So let's take 30 students in a high school class in ecology, a school that probably has a well-developed conflict resolution and leadership program. When a student who begins the semester with a limited sense of her agency becomes someone that students come to by the end of the semester to help resolve conflict, to help them think through problems in their field work. When she becomes someone who they turn to, and we can count these instances, to try to understand how to think more clearly about the future. How does our work, what sort of future should our project be aiming towards? We think that that student is demonstrating the attributes of transcendence. I can also talk about measuring the growth of courage. It quite often is the case that because of the classroom-driven hammering through material and focus on testing elements of many high schools, driven not by the preferences and desires of the teachers or the parents, but more by the external realities of the fact that our education system is largely built and designed to produce consumers and corporate agents and not human beings, that students find their ability to be brave and courageous, to strike out on a new path, to lead each other into inquiry about what's possible as opposed to what's been done, to avoid, in other words, path dependence. We think, Matt, that those instances of demonstration of courage or daring can be measured in the student experience, both objectively by the teacher and subjectively by what the students show. And I'm happy to go into that in more detail because we've developed a set of measures for each of these and a few other attributes of character that we haven't actually put down here. So
Thank you.
Question, though.
I'd be interested in getting that later.
I'm happy to take that offline, and if we have time at the end here, we'll come back to that. It's a great question. Anybody else have any questions or challenges or thoughts they'd like to dig into before I move it forward a little bit?
I can unmute another attendee if you're ready for another challenge.
Absolutely.
Let's see. Connected audio. I'm trying to unmute. Aura, would you like to ask your question of Ed? So I think Aura might be trying to unmute herself, but I'll read her comment.
Sure.
You can hear me, Ed, right? So as faculty, how are we to ask students what they want to learn and follow through when administrators are implementing top-down policies that promote standardized curriculum and the university to career pipeline? Also, how are we to expect students to know what they want to learn? For example, my university has accepted funding from a big bank on condition that Ayn Rand be taught. We have a new relationship with the Confucius Institute, which opposes discussion of Tiananmen Square and Tibet, etc.
Boy, this is a day-long conversation in itself. Laura, I want to also invite you to take this offline. Let me give you a couple of responses, and I'm going to work. Since you're posing this at the undergraduate level, I think I'm going to work at the high school level for just a minute. And then I want to talk about the color of money and how money moves in academic institutions. Sometimes it's a question of how a student wants to master a subject and not necessarily what they want to learn. Not all students are equally well prepared for answering that question, which is why we've tried this curriculum approach in classes as diverse as ecology, geography, and civics in well-to-do public school districts, in extremely challenged charter schools in tough districts like South Central Los Angeles and the eastern part of Oakland and South Philadelphia. Our work in trying to expose students to agency in terms of what they want to learn relates to asking less about curriculum and more about community. In other words, the question in a civics class might be, what is it that you want to understand to change some of the most unfair situations that your community faces? Sometimes it isn't a matter of asking the question so much about what they want to learn, but how they want to be or what they want to explore. And I think if I want to comment a little bit about the color of money, I've spent a lot of time doing relatively successful development work in higher education, whether to fund existing programs or to launch new institutes. And I find that who one takes money from obviously colors and directs the way that we do our work. And what I'll say is that the corporatization of higher education is subject for an entirely different webinar. But what we have found reliably is that when the pipeline leading to test-based learning and conventional education frustrates and gets in the way of students having a broad, well-rounded polytechnic experience, what we have found reliably is that engaging with the faculty community and engaging with the larger community supporting a school, whether at the undergraduate or high school level, the vast majority of people involved in decision-making, parents, teachers, administrators, want to provide broader polytechnic education and exploration, and that there are ways, if one is clever, it's just like clever lawyering, there's ways, if one is clever, of meeting the demands of a very factory-structured, mass production-inducing approach to meeting curriculum requirements if one can do the work in field work, if one can get into the community and do real-world learning. And Laura, I'd love to discuss this further with you in terms of specific instances. So it's a really good question, and I appreciate everybody taking the time to ask these thoughtful and provoking questions. Anything else before we talk a little bit about rootstock and move to national culture?
Nothing yet.
Well, I'll try to provoke some more. I just want to give credit where credit is due. Obviously, a lot of this approach to student inquiry is Steinerian. And although we have done some work in Waldorf schools, we haven't confined our work to that because that would throw off our data sets. The deschooling society inflections that Ivan Illich gives us, he talks a lot about the factory-based model of producing consumers in this wonderful but brief text, Deschooling Society. I've talked about the polytechnic learning model and the exploration of complex problem solving that can only be done with polytechnic thinking that's in E.O. Wilson's brilliant book, Consilience. Our national poet laureate, ecological, Wendell Berry, does not get enough attention, and I'll come to him in just a minute as we talk about culture. But I think his lyrical poetry that largely has to do with ecosystem is equally transmutable into problem solving for communities. And finally, one of the strongest influences in my academic learning and my research has been this principle of autopoiesis that Maturana and Varela talk about. I'm going to come back to this idea about holding students in love, because what we know, what the cognitive science tells us, what the brilliant, very polytechnic thinking of Maturana and Varela tell us, is that only in love can we be human, creative, and capable of envisioning a common future when society is riven into partisan sects. So I think this is really important, and that's why I provocatively, hopefully somewhat provocatively, titled this, or subtitled this, The Fight for Our National Culture. That's exactly the battle that we're in. We sort of have a divergent binary path here that we can go down towards either more partisanship and more division, and trying to find grounds of unity and healing some of the wounds that, depending on your political, well, actually, regardless of your point of view, are unquestionably holding our society from realizing its potential and our young people from realizing a shared and joyful and fulfilling future. I'm going to take a short diversion into regenerative design just because we have found that regenerative design is extremely important in terms of designing the learning space and curriculum. And I'm not going to belabor this, but this comes out of work that we have done in an industrial setting with designers. But whether it's designing a classroom, I'll back up and say that we stumbled across this when we were doing some work for a comprehensive college in upstate New York that wanted to completely rethink its business school curriculum and build a building that went far beyond the minimalist, least common denominator criteria of LEED construction. We wanted the entire building and every surface of it to be a teaching tool. To do this, we had to fundamentally rethink the learning space, not the teaching space, but the learning space. And these principles of regenerative design are extremely helpful to us when we try to rethink curriculum, measurement of learning, and the learning space, whether it's in the community and real world learning or in the classroom. And I'll leave that for further exploration. This is where our work in building the affectionate economy intersects with our work in character-based learning. Our theory is that whether we're looking at the problems facing us in terms of climate shift, whether we're looking at the problem of lack of access to financial tools and financial literacy and financial agency in communities of color, or the deeply and increasingly broad rifts in our society at the intersection of what I will call social justice broadly, localizing and having a fundamentally different approach to how we grow our communities in terms of economic and community development is essential. And this is what drives our learning and how we try to approach this issue of delivery of curriculum in the character-based learning modality to shift the economy to one that is regenerative, resilient, and humane. And our notion is that a curriculum that looks at place-based learning, or genius loci, this wonderful term that comes from John Tillman Lyle's work in architecture, spirit of place. The theory is that one learns differently about the role of food in a community if one is in an agricultural town in the Central Valley of California or a small town in central Iowa. as opposed to if one is in Greenwich Village, New York, or Santa Monica, California. Our commoditization of learning and classroom experiences and moving away from place-based learning is to our national detriment. And as you will all know, the fact that we have free public education up until the 12th grade is a result of our wonderful national agricultural exchange and agricultural learning programs, which originally were very place-based. And we take a biodynamic approach to cultivating culture, whether it's in a school, in a philanthropy, in a town, or in a company. That is to say, it is important to ask the question, what wants to grow in this soil? And when we put together curriculum in Toronto, Canada, it's very different in terms of how we think about curriculum in a place like Monterrey, Mexico. And we've lost the ability through homogenization to think about place-based learning, which is why we think that field work is very important. And I'm just going to give another bit of credit to our thinking about this. I will let those of you who teach in institutions of higher learning imagine the experience that I had when I turned in the MBA curriculum that had Saul Alinsky as one of the primary texts we were going to use in an MBA class in leadership. And I was called into the provost's office and asked what I was up to. And I said to this very nice woman, look, you brought me here to build leaders. And to build leaders, we have to understand the tools of social disruption. And she ended our meeting by saying, okay, Ed, but along the way, could you please teach them something useful? And others will judge whether that happened. I'm going to start landing the plane here and come on to this question of culture. We'll come back to these teaching cases if they're useful, but I want to pause again and invite contrary thoughts, challenges, questions of any kind.
A quick question on one of your slides. I think it was 2 slides back. One more, where there's an image of a structure of some kind in the lower right, and
Yep.
Someone is fascinated by it and wants to know, what is it?
Wonderful. So I worked for 8 years in a creative agency that was attached to an engineering firm. During this period of time, we were doing a great deal of work in far beyond sustainable building work in Europe, and we were collaborating with an organization that is now known as One Planet. I encourage you to take a look at the website, oneplanet.org. It's a UK-based curriculum organization that is working to build sustainable communities. This is a vertical agricultural platform in Melbourne, Australia. We put it together as a result of a collaboration with a foundation by a wine company that we did work with in the Barossa Valley in Australia. We wanted to have an urban agricultural scheme where we had apartments below and fields in vertical display above. And this is a rendering of a project that is known as, let me just look at my notes here. Yeah, Tiana Marketplace in Melbourne, Australia. And I'm happy to talk more about the background of this very fascinating project, but it's now being copied in eco-communities in Austria, in Stade, Austria, and there's a community doing this in the north side of Amsterdam, the city of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. So that's what that is. So
just to be clear,
vertical
that
agricultural platform.
That design includes housing in the lower level, and I wasn't clear, it was implemented or it remained at the design stage? It's
been built. It's been built and it's now being copied. So the apartments, the residential complex is in the lower right, to the bottom right of the opening on the lower floors. The agricultural platforms are in the vertical display at the top and in the back, and in the rest of the second, third, and fourth floors, those are solar panels that both process the water and provide energy for the residential units.
Very good. Thanks, Ed.
Yes, of course. And I'm conscious that we're getting close to the top of the hour and that some of you may need to drop off, so I'm going to talk a little bit about national culture and culture of a classroom, and whether it's the culture of a family, the culture of a creative agency, the culture of a nation, or the culture of a philanthropy. We think that these things that Wendell Berry talks about a communal order of memory, insight, value, work, this wonderful and lost term conviviality, reverence and aspiration are what brings us together as human beings. It's what gives us a sense of common purpose, whether we're helping our children move through their lives as parents, whether we're helping our loved ones find a sense of purpose in community, or whether as mentors and advisors to students at the undergraduate and graduate level, we're trying to help students find fulfilling, meaningful, engaging work that serves more than just advancing the role of the conventional economy. And we think this structure of memory, insight, value, work, for those of you who speak Spanish, this wonderful phrase, conviviality, convivir, to live with joy, is so central and so lost. This is what weaves together our work in our agency, and it's what I try to build when I'm putting together a classroom. We think that the character-based education and learning model that we've developed helps people understand what culture really is. And if there's a way for us to find a path back to having a shared national culture, a culture that celebrates diversity, a culture that provides agency and equal opportunity, it's only going to be through trying to build culture at the micro level that we can find it again at the macro level. And in this respect, I would also mention this brilliant work. There's a quote here from Maturana and Varela that we think about all the time as we frame our commissions and as we do our work in character-based learning. This idea of love is counterposed with so much of the othering that we see in society. We are now embarked, funded by the Latino Community Foundation here in California and the Gates Foundation of Washington State, on a national initiative to have a conversation that no one appears to have been willing to have. We have now catalyzed a group of social justice organizations in the Southeast, led by the Southern Baptist Leadership Conference, to bring together a group of national social justice organizations in Chicago in March with the leaders of some of the neo-Nazi and nationalist sympathizing and KKK sympathizing groups to do battlefield diplomacy in a fight for the heart of our nation. And this is very much going to be character-based inquiry. The problem we have right now is that, setting aside political views and other dynamics, no one is willing to ask the question, why are we othering these people who are causing this great national rift? And we think that it's because the work of a diplomat, which is fundamentally to take people who are engaging in violence to each other on the battlefield one day and you get them into a conference room and trying to work out a peace accord the next, you have to hold these people in love and to see the other as a legitimate entity and coexistence with oneself. And this is how we have found students from very broad economic divides working together almost without intervention. If we create a space of love, trust, and devotional commitment to their future, we have found students from very wealthy and very disadvantaged communities working together on common complex problems in a way that adults never could, because we eliminate the context of othering. And this principle that learning, collaboration, and creativity can only happen when we function in love is central to the way that we do our work in the classroom and the way that we do our work as creative agents. And this really just lands the plane on the question of, what the ultimate motivation is. This is fundamentally a bunch of revolutionary ideas, but they come back to this simple idea of culture and love. And anybody who's taught and looked into the eyes of a young learner and realized that they're expecting you to help them see their future, it's a tremendous burden, but a brilliant and unique opportunity. And if we don't take a more revolutionary approach and get comfortable with the idea that our national culture is at stake here, if we don't do those things, we think that all we can expect is more of the same and past dependence and a not very bright future. The good news is we think these models work. Each of you in your own way is already contributing to making the learning gestures of our country more sane, relevant, and humane. And I've enjoyed your questions, and I'm happy to continue the discussion and take on any challenges and other questions you have. But that's the front and back of what I'd hope to work through with you all this morning / afternoon.
Well, thank you, Ed. I will wait for a minute or two and see if there are any further comments that pop into the chat box. But on behalf of the attendees, I want to thank you for a fascinating, thought-provoking presentation. I think that if you would like to mention your email address or other contact information, I have a feeling that folks who have heard the presentation are going to need to think about what they heard and follow up with you thereafter. We can also make arrangements to have a further dialogue on these topics led by you through Sustainability Curriculum Consortium. I see Ed has placed his email address into the chat box. For those listening via recording after the fact, Ed's email address is equevedo, agp@gmail.com.
I would also say that on the oh, sorry, go ahead, Aaron.
equevedo, agp, no dots or underscores, equevedo, agp@gmail.com. Go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, I was just going to say that my email address and phone number are on the slides as well. IREC has that information, but I'll give you all my mobile number, which is the easiest number to use to reach me. You can call me anytime, and I'm happy to get back to you and have further conversation. And I'm also happy if there's an interest to do a second dive into this topic through SCC. But my mobile number is area code 415-918-0967. Again, 415-918-0967.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you to the attendees who have stayed with us through the entire webinar. Again, I will mention for further information about the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium and our range of activities, our distribution list, our newsletter, and our planning for the next faculty conference, please go to www.curriculumforsustainability.org. And with that, we are going to sign off for today. Once again, our thanks to Ed Quevedo.
And thanks to you all, and Ira, certainly thanks to you. Wishing you all a good afternoon and a good rest of the week.